I still remember that night, when everyone sat around the long wooden table in the reading room. The chandelier cast its light down on tense faces. Jonathan, the family's loyal lawyer, broke the seal on the envelope, his voice slow and steady. Yet each word cut the air like a blade. Most of Mr. Edward Wilson's estate will be transferred to the post-war relief fund in Vietnam. The room erupted. Michael slammed his hand on the table, shouting, "Impossible. I'll sue." Laura burst into tears, her makeup smudging. "Father has betrayed us." Simon let out a bitter laugh. "Perfect. We've become a laughingstock for the whole world." And I, Eleanor Wilson, his widow. Their mother sat frozen, feeling the floor crumble beneath my feet. In the frantic eyes of my children, I saw only one thought: wealth. No one spoke of a father's love. No one remembered the legacy of a man who once went to war and carried countless wounds in his heart. Jonathan tapped the table lightly and drew out another envelope. "There is still a second will, a trial of sorts." His voice dropped lower, but remained firm. "If you wish to claim the rest of the estate, first, you must repay your debt to humanity." If you're watching this video, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd be so happy to connect with you. My name is Eleanor Wilson, 68 years old. When people look at me, they often whisper, "What a lucky woman, living in the grandest white mansion in the neighborhood, with 3 successful children." They aren't wrong. My house does radiate extravagance. The heavy wrought iron gates, the marble steps, the high ceilings crowned with chandeliers glittering like a sky condensed into crystal. Yet sometimes, standing in those vast, echoing rooms, I feel like nothing more than a shadow drifting through a place too big, too cold. I've been a widow for not long. Edward, my husband, passed away after a heart attack. He was the man whose name the entire city knew, a benevolent real estate tycoon. As the newspapers called him, people admired him, respected him. But I knew better. Edward was both powerful and reserved, keeping so much locked inside that even I, his wife, could not always reach him. But that is for later. Today, I want to tell of the fateful dinner when I realized the perfect facade of my family was beginning to crack. The Wilson mansion shone each night like a palace. That evening, I sat at the head of the long dining table Edward's seat for so many years. Michael, my eldest son, wore an expensive gray suit. His face as stern as stone even as he lifted his wine glass. Laura, my daughter, glittered in a sparkling dress, her chair scented with the trace of costly perfume. Simon, my youngest, arrived late as usual, his shirt untucked, his eyes red, no doubt from some party before dropping by. From the outside, anyone would think our family was perfect. 3 grown children, all accomplished, gathered in a lavish room. But as I sat there, I could hear the distance. It lingered in every hollow clink of glasses, every perfunctory nod. The laughter was gone, the same laughter that once filled the air when they were children, fighting to tell stories from school until Edward had to tap his spoon against the table to restore order. "Mother," Simon muttered lazily, lifting his glass of water, "this mansion will need a caretaker someday, won't it?" "I'm guessing Michael will be the first to snatch it." Michael shot his brother a glance, eyes heavy as steel. "At least I know how to preserve it without turning it into a den for drunken friends." Laura sighed, cutting in with sharp irritation. "Can the 2 of you stop fighting for just one dinner? We're here to eat, not to divide spoils." I forced a thin smile, placing a piece of beef on my plate. 3 siblings, 3 temperaments, 3 separate worlds. And yet, in that moment, I heard it clear, as if someone had whispered right behind my shoulder the words that made my heart sink. "Just as soon as Father is gone." I turned my head, but no one was looking at me. Michael kept lazily swirling his wine glass. Laura's eyes were fixed on her phone. Simon fiddled with the silver spoon. Had I imagined it? Or had someone really spoken so softly that no one else seemed to notice? In that instant, Edward came back to me in memory sitting by the fire, his deep voice telling me about his years on the battlefield in Indochina. He would often say, "The most frightening thing isn't death. It's when people forget why they're alive." His words echoed in my mind now, as if warning me that perhaps Edward had foreseen the shadow creeping toward this family. I sat there, looking at my 3 children, the ones I loved more than myself, and for a moment, they felt like strangers. They were eating dinner in a house flooded with light, while my own heart dimmed. I knew from this moment on, our family would no longer be at peace. I froze, the silver chopsticks suspended in midair. That sentence, "just as soon as father is gone," kept reverberating inside me, a tiny crack louder than any other sound in this bright room. I didn't know which of them had let it slip. Perhaps Michael, with his cold ambition. Perhaps Simon, with his impulsive carelessness. Or Laura, restless to prove herself. But did it matter? What mattered was that all 3 of them had already thought it. I looked quietly at each face. Michael, his features hard as stone, his eyes reflecting ambition. Laura, sitting proud yet with shoulders trembling whenever she felt forgotten in the glow. Simon, weary-eyed, fleeing from himself, seeking joy in pointless parties. They were my own flesh and blood, yet suddenly they seemed like distant guests seated around my table. Dinner went on. The clink of knives and forks against porcelain, the faint chime of crystal glasses. Everything was perfect, candles glowing, tenderloin cooked just right, fine red wine poured into cut glass. Yet no one truly savored it. No one truly looked at one another. I suddenly remembered years gone by, when this kitchen was filled with the smell of apple pie and the laughter of children. Simon once ran circles around the table. Laura helped me set the dishes, while Michael sat beside his father, hanging on every story about business. Now, each of them sat in their own world, oceans apart. "How much do you think father will leave to each of us?" Laura asked, her voice flat, as if inquiring about stock prices. Michael shrugged. "Enough to carry on the business. If he's wise, he'll entrust it to someone who knows how to manage." Simon sneered. "You mean yourself?" "Don't kid yourself, Michael. Father knows perfectly well how ambitious you are." The words sliced back and forth, cold as little blades. I sat still, feeling my chest tighten. I wanted to speak, wanted to shout. "Your father is still alive. Don't just wait for him to die so you can calculate." But my throat locked. I knew that saying it now would change nothing. My eyes drifted to the great portrait on the wall. Edward, in a dark suit, standing proudly before the Wilson Realty headquarters. His face was stern, but in his eyes I always saw a hidden sorrow. He once told me, "Eleanor, the hardest part isn't building an empire. It's keeping the family together after you're gone." I hadn't understood why he said that on the night we celebrated our 40th anniversary. Now I did. He had foreseen it, the invisible gulf widening between father and children, between blood bound by name yet estranged in heart. I sat there in silence, letting the arguments drip onto the table like cracks spreading across glass. Everything appeared luxurious, flawless, but it was only a facade. Beneath it, coldness, ambition, and selfishness gnawed away at every shred of family affection. When dinner ended, Michael rushed off, answering a business call before his chair had cooled. Laura lingered a few minutes to fix her makeup, then vanished in the click of her heels. Simon was the last to rise, stretching, leaving his chair rocking behind him. The vast room was left to me alone, the candles guttering low, silence pressing heavy. I stayed a while longer, listening to the steady tick of the grandfather clock. Inside me, an old fear returned. Had I failed by letting such a terrible distance grow within my own home? I closed my eyes. I could almost hear Edward's voice whispering from somewhere far away, "Eleanor, be ready. They will need a shock to wake them." And I knew that shock was drawing near. When a man who has spent his whole life standing tall begins to falter, the entire house seems to sag with him. For me, that image began one March morning, When Edward clutched the stair rail and gasped for breath as though he had scaled a mountain. Of course, he wouldn't admit it. Just age, he said, brushing off my worry with a strained smile. But I knew his heart had grown weary after years of carrying burdens too heavy for one soul. Only weeks later, we were in the hospital. Cold white lights replaced the warm golden glow of the Wilson kitchen. I sat beside his bed, holding his hand, staring into eyes that were tired yet still sharp. Edward was never the kind of man to retreat easily, but this time, I could see him slipping. Michael came to visit with his usual air of busyness, phone never leaving his hand. He spoke to the doctor as though negotiating a deal concise, cutting, devoid of a sun's warmth. Laura arrived draped in fur, her hair perfect, as if she had just stepped out of a photo shoot. She lingered by the bedside only minutes before updating her social media. Prayers for father, captioned beneath a dim, hospital-lit photo. Simon came last, masking liquor with cologne, forcing a smile as he kissed his father's forehead. I sat there, heart heavy. Each of my children was present, but none were truly there. They surrounded Edward's sick bed, but their eyes drifted elsewhere to a future without him. That night, when Edward finally drifted into sleep, I stepped into the corridor and stumbled upon whispers. "How much do you think he'll leave each of us?" Laura's voice, small but unmistakably eager, tinged with tension. Michael answered, low but firm, "Don't worry. He's already discussed it with me. If there's a division, most will fall to me. I know how to run things. The rest, he'll probably split between the two of you. You always think you're the better one." Simon sneered, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "If father has any sense, he won't hand it all to someone as cold as you. But never mind, it doesn't matter. He's leaving soon, and the money will still flow into the Wilson name. One way or another, we'll all get our share." I pressed against the wall, my hands trembling. Every word pierced me with ice. My children, rather than fearing for their father, were already calculating his estate. While his breath still rasped inside that room, I wanted to step out, to shout at them. "Enough. Your father isn't gone yet. Don't turn his sick bed into a chessboard of inheritance." But my feet rooted to the tile. I chose silence. Perhaps I was afraid that my words wouldn't stir them. Afraid Edward would only be wounded more if he knew. In the darkness of the hospital corridor, I listened to the echo of their footsteps fade. And then it was only me left, a wife, a mother trapped between the love for my husband and the gnawing fear of what had become of the children I had borne. That night, when the hospital sank into silence, I sat beside Edward. He opened his eyes and looked at me with the gaze I had known through 40 years of marriage, strong, yet carrying a quiet sorrow. "Do you remember the nights at the base?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. I nodded. How could I forget? All these years, Edward had often spoken of his time in Indochina, where he was stationed after World War II. He rarely shared it with others, but with me, he revealed wounds no doctor could heal. I remember how he sat in the dark, the firelight flickering across his face. He spoke of damp jungles, gunfire tearing through the night, and the haunted eyes of orphans staring at American soldiers with both fear and hunger. "Eleanor," he once told me, "we won a war on paper, but in my heart, I lost forever." He carried guilt for leaving behind shattered lives. And I knew, deep down, the war had never truly ended for Edward. It clung to him like a shadow. I squeezed his hand. "You did all you could. You can't carry the world's suffering on your shoulders." But Edward only shook his head, his eyes drifting far away. "You don't understand. Some debts aren't owed by nations, but by men. I owe them, Eleanor, and I will have to repay." I stayed silent. At times like these, I knew better than to argue. The next morning, while Michael busied himself on the phone, Laura retouched her lipstick, and Simon dozed in the chair. I saw Edward signal me toward the brown leather bag in the bedside cabinet. He pulled out a thick, sealed envelope and looked at me, his eyes strangely bright against his gaunt face. "Give this to Jonathan," he said. Your lawyer? I frowned. He nodded. I trust him. Jonathan understands me. He'll know what to do when the time comes. I held the envelope. Its weight far heavier than paper alone. On its yellowed surface was one familiar line in his handwriting. For the future of our family. I looked at my husband, wanting to ask more. But Edward squeezed my hand gently and shook his head. Not yet, Eleanor. Just promise me you'll do exactly as I've said. Speechless, I could only nod. That afternoon, I left the hospital quietly, carrying the envelope into Jonathan Price's office. He greeted me with a steady handshake, his eyes stern yet warm. I placed the envelope in his hands, feeling as though I had set down a burden too heavy to name. Jonathan looked at me, then at the envelope, and simply nodded. Not a word more. On the way home, the rain began to fall, streaking across the car windows. Through the blurred glass, I thought of Edward's words. I will have to repay. A shiver ran through me. Perhaps our family was about to face a storm no one could withstand. Edward left us on a morning so quiet I could have sworn the whole city paused in mourning. He simply didn't wake after a long night of labored breathing. When the doctor delivered the words, "I'm sorry," all I heard was a hollow echo. Then a heavy silence wrapping around me. 40 years of marriage. Countless mornings spent drinking coffee together by the window, all of it sealed shut. In a single blink, Edward's funeral, as expected, became an event of grandeur. Luxury cars lined the street outside the old stone church. Wreaths carpeted the entrance and stretched deep into the nave. Hundreds dressed in solemn black filed inside. Many faces I had never seen, but they came to honor the benevolent real estate tycoon. As the morning headlines proclaimed, I sat in the front pew, my hands clasped tightly together. Funeral hymns rose, the choir's farewell deepening the solemn air. Newspapers praised him loudly. Edward Wilson, a symbol of success and compassion. The man who built an empire yet never forgot his community. They called him a man of his era. But I knew, behind those headlines, Edward carried layers of sorrow only I had witnessed. He was a stern father, a quiet husband, a veteran forever shadowed by war. Compassionate, yes, but not the whole truth. There were nights when he tossed and turned, fists clenched white, and I had to rouse him from nightmares that refused to let him go. No glossy article would ever write of those nights. When the casket was carried in, candlelight danced across the polished wood, making it gleam like a sacred relic. Michael sat beside me, his face severe, betraying little emotion. Laura wept, but her tears mingled truth with performance. I could no longer tell the difference. Simon kept his head bowed, fists pressed hard against his knees, as though hiding a restlessness he couldn't contain. I lifted my gaze to Edward's portrait. In that photograph, he smiled serenely, eyes shining with the confidence of a man who had weathered both war and the business world. My heart tightened. That man had once been my unshakable anchor, the hand that guided me through every storm. Now, all that remained was a frame of glass. Everything around me was so lavish, so ceremonious. It seemed to swallow grief itself. Yet inside my chest, I heard only the quiet splintering of something irreplaceable. I knew that when the earth closed over Edward, it would bury not just his body, but a part of my heart as well. As the funeral ended, I watched the sea of mourners dissolve into the procession of luxury cars outside. Wreaths, eulogies, embraces of condolence all retreated behind me. But in the eyes of my children, I caught something different. A glint not of sorrow, but of calculation. Michael whispered to a colleague as soon as he left the chapel. The will should be announced soon. I have to make sure the company doesn't waver. His voice was low, but to a mother's ear, I caught every word. Laura wiped her tears. Yet only minutes later her phone was in hand, fingers tapping furiously, surely updating her following with some carefully framed caption. Simon, his eyes bloodshot, slipped out to the porch, took a long drag of his cigarette, and half joked to his friends, "Should be enough to keep me comfortable for a few years." I went still. Even with their father freshly laid to rest, their minds clung to one thing: inheritance. Perhaps I had hoped for too much that at least today they might share grief together. Instead, each of them saw in their father's death nothing more than an opening to satisfy their own ambition. My heart ached as I recalled that last moment in the hospital. Edward had gripped my hand, his eyes dim yet shining with a strange calm. No trembling, no panic, only serenity, as if he had already placed his final piece on the board. I had whispered, Are you ready?" He gave the faintest nod, a shadow of a smile. Then his hand slackened, and his last breath slipped away like a passing breeze. In that instant, I knew Edward had not left in fear. He left as a man who had prepared everything. Tonight, alone in the mansion, I passed by the study where Edward once sat writing. His favorite fountain pen still rested on the desk beside an unfinished notebook. I opened it to find only a few scattered lines. "The true legacy does not lie in bank accounts." The sentence trailed off, but I understood what he had meant to write. I lingered before that page for a long time. Somewhere out there, my 3 children were surely counting down the days until Jonathan, the lawyer, would read the will aloud. As for me, I could not tell if I was waiting in hope or in dread, for Edward's peaceful eyes before closing had already told me. He left behind something more than money, and in that silence, I heard a whisper deep within my heart. The storm has not begun. Today is only the calm before it breaks. 3 days after the funeral, we gathered in the dark wood office of Jonathan Price, the lawyer who had stood by Edward for more than 30 years. The room, perched high in an old stone building, looked out through wide windows over the city center, where towers built by Wilson Realty still rose like pillars of power. I sat in the front chair, my hands clasped in my lap. Michael sat opposite, tense but trying to appear composed. Laura wore a sleek business dress, her fingers endlessly twisting the diamond ring on her hand. Simon lounged back in his chair, tapping a rhythm against the polished wooden floor. Jonathan, in a dark suit and silver-rimmed glasses, opened the file before him. He looked up, his voice slow but deliberate. "Mr. Edward Wilson, in this legally binding will, has decided." The room froze. I could even hear the pendulum clock ticking in the hallway. That the majority of his estate, including real estate, company shares, and personal savings, shall be transferred to the Vietnam War Relief Fund. I held my breath. Michael blinked rapidly, as if he couldn't trust his ears. Laura exhaled sharply, while Simon gave a hollow laugh, whether from shock or bitterness, I could not tell. Jonathan paused, letting his eyes sweep across my 3 children, then continued. "For his family, Mr. Wilson leaves a smaller portion, but this may only be claimed once the attached conditions are fully met." "Conditions?" Michael cut in, his voice dry. "My father was a practical man. Surely he wouldn't leave games inside a legal document." Jonathan met his stare calmly. "Not a game, Michael. His final will." The air grew heavier with every word. Inside, I felt no surprise. I had seen the peace in Edward's eyes before his death. He had set something in motion. Yet surrounded by children brimming with ambition, I knew this was only the storm's beginning. Laura spoke, her voice trembling but hard. "He abandoned his own family, only to give everything to some charity halfway across the world, and we are left with scraps tied to conditions? This is absurd." Simon chuckled, tilting his chair back. "See, I told you. Father always lived by his own rules, never caring what anyone thought. But honestly, to leave the entire fortune to strangers across the Pacific? I've never heard anything so insane." Michael gripped the handle of his leather case, his eyes sharp as blades. "Jonathan, read on. I want to hear it all. I refuse to believe my father would betray his family like this." Jonathan nodded, turning the page. His voice grew firm. Edward wrote clearly, "I owed those people a part of my life. I leave this to them because it is the right thing. My family, if they wish to inherit, must first learn to repay their own debt to humanity." His words echoed through the closed room, each syllable dropping like a stone. I looked at my children. In their eyes, there was no grief, only fury, suspicion, and wounded greed. And within me, pain and relief warred, because I knew Edward had never done anything without reason. The air pressed in so tightly I could hear the clock's hands strike each second. Michael was the first to break the silence. Most of the estate. To a fund in Vietnam? His voice cracked with anger. Father spent a lifetime building Wilson Realty, only to hand it all to strangers? This is outright betrayal of his own blood. Laura suddenly burst into tears, her shoulders trembling. I gave my whole youth living in Father's shadow. He never truly saw me. And now, even at the very end, he abandons me just to prove what? That we're unworthy? Simon narrowed his eyes, a thin smile twisting his lips. Classic father. Always noble, always carrying the world's burdens. But when it came to his own family, it's as if he saw us as greedy fools, unfit for his trust. He never believed in us at all. Their words cut through me. Deep down, I knew Edward had not betrayed us. He acted from something greater, a debt that had gnawed at him for decades. But my children, who never heard his midnight confessions about war, who never saw him wake drenched in sweat from nightmares, could only see it as cruelty. Michael slammed his palm against the table, his voice hard as steel. I will not accept this. There must be a way to contest it, to overturn it. No father has the right to strip his own children's future away. Jonathan lifted his gaze, calm but unyielding. Michael, this will is legal, fully certified. Edward was of sound mind. He knew precisely what he was doing. Laura sobbed, then turned on me. Mother, did you know about this? Were you complicit with him? How could you let him treat us like this? My heart clenched. I wanted to gather them into my arms, to tell them I shared their pain. But I could not betray Edward's memory. I only shook my head and whispered, I didn't know, but I believe. Your father had his reasons. Reasons? Simon laughed bitterly. He leaves us scraps, while throwing everything at strangers across the ocean. What reason could possibly make sense of that? The room was strung taut, like a violin string on the verge of snapping. Then Jonathan closed the file softly, his eyes moving across their burning faces. His voice was steady, yet heavy with weight. There's another envelope. Edward left you a second will, what he called a testament of trial. The room froze. I saw Michael stiffen, Laura's head snap up, Simon frown in confusion. Jonathan laid his hand on a thick, sealed brown envelope. Inside, he said slowly, are the conditions he set. If you fulfill them, you may claim what remains of the estate. If not, everything will remain with the War Relief Fund. I stared at the envelope, feeling Edward's presence fill the room, his eyes glowing in the dark, just as on the night he last held my hand, and I knew the true storm had begun. The moment Jonathan set the testament of trial envelope on the table, the air in the room shattered. Michael shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward, his face flushed crimson, words hissing through clenched teeth. No, I will not accept this. I'll sue. I'll take this to court and let the world see my father was manipulated. No sane man would ever write such a thing. Laura broke down, mascara streaking down her cheeks. She covered her face, sobbing as she repeated, Why? Why did he despise us so? I gave everything, lived up to every expectation only to be denied like this. Simon gave a cold chuckle, clapping slowly as if watching a stage play. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Even from the grave, Father knows how to pull the strings. Now we're puppets, forced to dance for crumbs. I sat there, my heart clenched in a vice. The children I had nurtured, raised with every breath of love, were now screaming, accusing, dragging each other into the abyss. Michael's glare slashed toward me. You knew about this, didn't you? You must have been complicit. Father wouldn't leave such a deranged will unless someone persuaded him. I froze. Michael, I swear, I knew nothing. Your father kept everything to himself. All I knew was that he trusted Jonathan. But my words fell flat. Laura's swollen eyes bored into me. You've always stood by him. Never once did you stand with us. Even now, you protect him. So what are we to you? Just pieces in his game? Simon leaned back in his chair, waving his hand as if to end the scene. I'm not surprised. Father trusted control above all, and Mother followed him without question. Now we're a circus. The press must be feasting already, waiting to write. Wilson family at war over Will. I felt the heat rise to my face. I wanted to scream, to tell them my love had never wavered, that I was as lost and hurt as they were. But in that moment, I felt only the weight of isolation. Mother turned stranger in the eyes of her own children. Jonathan remained still, his face composed as stone. He let the storm rage, as though he had long anticipated it. And I knew this was only the first gust of the true hurricane. The anger in that office hadn't even settled before news erupted outside. 2 days later, headlines plastered every paper. The strange will of Edward Wilson, billions flowing to Vietnam. Tabloids jeered with louder tones. Wilson children left with nothing? Journalists camped at the gates of the mansion, cameras flashing at every creak of the door. Neighbors whispered behind their curtains. Rumors spread like wildfire. No one spoke of the grand funeral anymore, only of the spectacle of 3 wealthy heirs. Abandoned by their father, Laura refused to leave the house, retreating to her room like a shadow. Simon plunged deeper into parties, laughing louder to mask the sting. Michael spent every day on the phone with new lawyers, hunting for loopholes to overturn the will. And I, every time I went to the market or stepped onto the porch, felt the weight of the world's eyes on my back. One afternoon, Jonathan arrived again. He set his leather briefcase on the table, calm as always, but I could see a grave weight in his eyes. My 3 children gathered reluctantly, still carrying the sharp smell of recent arguments. Jonathan opened the case and drew out a neatly folded sheet. This is a private message within the will that Mr. Edward asked me to read at exactly this time. He said, and no one spoke. I could hear the clock's hands sliding through each second. Jonathan began to read, his voice low and deliberate, each word falling like stone. If you wish to receive the remaining inheritance, you must first repay your debt to humanity. The room froze. Michael's brow furrowed, Laura's eyes flared, and Simon let out a disbelieving laugh. Repay a debt? Who do we owe? Michael snarled. Laura cried out. Father turns us into some moral spectacle? Even in death he still wants control. Simon clapped his hands, his voice cutting like glass. Perfect. A real play. Want the money? Then play the good person? Father sure knew how to lecture. I sat in silence, but inside, storms churned. Because I understood Edward. I remembered the nights he spoke of orphans' eyes on the battlefield, of soldiers who never came home. I owe them, he had told me. And now he wanted our children to learn that debt too. Jonathan folded the paper again, his calm gaze sweeping across their angry faces. This isn't vague sentiment. This is the condition. And if you do not fulfill it, the entire remaining estate will permanently belong to the War Relief Fund. No one said another word. Only the pounding of my own heart remained, and the vision of Edward in my mind, his serene eyes as he left this world. He had prepared for this moment, and I knew this was only the first step. Jonathan quietly opened the second envelope. The rustle of paper in the silent room sounded like wind whistling through a crack before a storm. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses, eyes falling on the final lines Edward had left. Mr. Edward has written clearly, Jonathan began slowly, that the remainder of his estate will only be given to his children, if each fulfills their individual responsibility. This is not a game. It is his last wish. Michael straightened in his chair, his face tightening. Laura stopped crying, her eyes fixed on Jonathan's hands. Simon wore a half smile, half grimace, as though he had already heard enough to call it absurd. Jonathan read on. Michael, my eldest son, you have been well educated, successful in business, but you have forgotten the roots of sacrifice. I want you to devote your strength to helping disabled veterans, those who traded their youth and their flesh so that you might have freedom. Help them reintegrate, find work, and reclaim their worth. When you have done this, you will understand responsibility. Michael gripped the armrest, his jaw set. I'm a businessman, not a philanthropist, he muttered. Yet in his eyes I glimpsed a flicker of unease, as if his father's words had struck a nerve he'd long ignored. Jonathan turned to the next page. Laura, my daughter, you live among mirrors and spotlights, but I know your heart longs to be truly seen. I want you to walk alongside war widows, women who lost their husbands, their peace, their lives. Organize community support. Use your voice and your image to bring them hope. Only when you learn to share their pain will you find yourself. Laura gasped. War widows? I've never met them. I don't know anything about that kind of hardship. Father wants me to drop my career, my connections, and go take care of strangers. Her voice trembled, part anger, part fear. Jonathan said nothing, simply turned to the final sheet. Simon, my youngest son, you have always run from responsibility, seeking joy in trivial distractions. I want you to live in an orphanage for at least 6 months, not as a visitor, but as a caretaker, feeding them, teaching them, sharing their days. If you do this, you will learn that maturity does not come from money but from becoming a pillar for someone else. Simon laughed out loud, but there was no mirth in it. Perfect. 6 months in an orphanage? Father thinks I'm a babysitter? I can't even handle my own life. How am I supposed to handle a pack of kids? I sat there, my heart aching and tightening at once. My 3 children, each handed a heavy challenge, as if Edward had looked straight into the cracks of their souls. And I understood this was his final way of holding them close, of forcing them to step out of their own shadows. Jonathan set the stack of papers down on the table, his steady eyes moving over each of the Wilson children. These are your father's words. If you refuse, the inheritance will be lost. If you fulfill them, you will gain not only the wealth, but a greater legacy for this family. In that heavy room, I could hear my own heartbeat mingling with the ragged breaths of my children, and I knew the road ahead, for them and for me, would be anything but smooth. The silence lasted only a few seconds before it shattered into an uncontrollable storm of voices. Michael slammed his hand on the table, his tone sharp as steel. Father expects me to turn the company into a charity. I bled to keep Wilson Realty standing, and now I'm supposed to divert resources to veterans I don't even know? If he truly wanted to help, he should have used his own funds, not forced me to carry the burden. Laura shot to her feet, tears streaming, but her voice cut cold. War widows? I've never met them, never even stepped into their world. Father always wanted me to live by his rules, gentle, selfless, sacrificial, but I already sacrificed my youth, suffocated under his shadow. I don't owe them anything, and I don't owe him anything either. Simon leaned back, laughing bitterly, his voice ringing across the room. Ridiculous. I'm supposed to give up parties, abandon my friends, and spend 6 months with orphans? What did Father think I was? If I could do that, the sun would rise in the west. I sat quietly, listening to each word, my heart splintering piece by piece. My children, rather than seeing a chance to change, saw only a sentence handed down. But deep inside, I knew Edward had arranged it deliberately. He wanted them to confront the weakest corners of themselves. Jonathan remained where he was, calm as a stone in the middle of a raging sea. When the noise subsided, he finally spoke, slow and deliberate. You are free to object, but the truth is this will has been legally validated. Edward made it clear. If these conditions are not fulfilled, you will not receive a single cent. The entire estate will go to the War Relief Fund. There is no detour, no compromise. Michael narrowed his eyes, his voice sharp with fury. Are you mocking me? I can drag this into court. Jonathan met his gaze, firm and unwavering. You can try, but remember your father never left loopholes in his work. This time, He was even more meticulous. He wanted you to understand. No success endures without character. Laura broke into sobs, collapsing into her chair, her hands covering her face. Simon, frustrated, hurled a pen across the table. It rolled noisily, a hollow rattle like a bell tolling helplessness. I closed my eyes, and in my mind appeared Edward's face on that final night, his eyes calm, as though he had passed the entire burden to me. I wanted to embrace my children, to tell them this was not punishment but opportunity. Yet I knew if I spoke now, they would not listen. Jonathan gathered the papers and stood. You have time to consider, but remember, no completion, no inheritance. The door closed behind him, leaving the suffocating room. My 3 children scattered apart, each in their own corner, eyes burning with anger and hurt, and I sat in silence, feeling as though I were watching the cracks in our family wall widen with each breath. In that deepest quiet, Edward's voice rose again in my memory. The true legacy is not in money. It lies in how we choose to live and to love. I remember that morning clearly. The sky was layered with heavy gray clouds, mirroring the weight inside each of my children. Jonathan had arranged everything. He wanted them to begin at once, leaving no room for hesitation. Michael was the first to face his trial. A meeting with disabled veterans was held in a modest community hall on the outskirts of the city. I sat quietly in the back row, watching my son enter, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, into a room filled with men leaning on crutches, confined to wheelchairs, their faces weathered by sun and hardship. When the coordinator introduced him, "This is Mr. Michael Wilson, here to discuss employment opportunities with us," I saw dozens of eyes turn to him, and for the first time, Michael did not look sure of himself. He tugged at his tie, forcing a strained smile. A veteran, only a few years older than Michael, but with both legs gone below the knee, leaned on his crutch and asked bluntly, "Mr. Wilson, what have you ever done to deserve this freedom you enjoy?" The question landed heavy as stone. Michael froze, his eyes blinking rapidly. He was used to boardrooms, to investors, to numbers and graphs. But here, no figure could answer. His lips moved, stammering, I manage a large corporation, and I believe I can create opportunities for you." But the words rang hollow, vanishing in the air thick with sweat and fractured pride. I watched him fiddle with his pen, so unsure that even I, his mother, felt my chest tighten with pain. Meanwhile, Laura was sent to a small community center. A circle of women sat close together, faces etched with hardship, eyes lined by time. They were war widows, women who had lost their husbands, their anchors. Laura entered in high heels, a fitted dress, a glittering designer handbag dangling from her arm. The entire room seemed to fall out of harmony at her presence. I saw her frown slightly when asked to sit on a creaky wooden chair, her hand clutching the bag as if afraid it might be stained. One frail woman with silver hair shared her story. Her husband had died in his early 30s, leaving her with 3 small children. "I had to work 3 jobs to raise them," she said hoarsely. "Even now, there are nights I wake, thinking he just walked through the door." I turned my eyes to Laura. She smiled politely, nodded repeatedly, but her gaze was distant. When another woman handed her a faded photo of her husband in uniform, Laura shifted uncomfortably, tugging at her sleeve, then diverted the subject to fundraising events as though she were hosting a press interview. I could see the gulf clearly, an invisible wall rising between my daughter and those women. Laura didn't know how to sit among them, didn't know what to say in the face of pain that could never be measured by wealth or spotlight. Watching my 2 children, Michael adrift among veterans, Laura adrift among widows, my heart tightened. These were only the first steps, and already the ground beneath them shook. If Michael and Laura seemed misplaced, then Simon looked like someone flung into a world he could not comprehend. That afternoon, Jonathan brought him to an orphanage on the edge of town. The old house stood with peeling paint, its iron gate shrieking as it opened. From the yard came a chorus of children's voices, laughing, crying, calling to one another. I stood on the porch, watching Simon enter, his face twisted in distaste. Good God, this is what they call a home? He muttered, clutching his phone as though it were a talisman. A little girl, no more than 8, ran up to him, hand outstretched. Are you here to play with us, Uncle? Her gap-toothed smile was so pure it made my chest ache. But Simon only frowned, stepping aside. Inside, the dining hall held worn wooden tables, stacks of plastic bowls, and the lingering smell of cold food. A boy sat huddled in the corner, eyes lifting to Simon with cautious curiosity. Jonathan explained, "You will live here for at least 6 months, sharing everything with these children. This is not a visit. This is where you must stay." Simon scoffed, his voice sharp. 6 months? You've got to be kidding me. I can't even cook my own breakfast now. I'm supposed to feed porridge to these kids. Another child tugged at Simon's sleeve, holding out a frayed teddy bear. Will you keep this safe for me? Simon recoiled, his expression as if touched by something filthy. I watched, my heart breaking more than at any quarrel. My youngest, once a tender-hearted boy, now seemed so hardened. Late that night, after returning, Simon shouted at me, "Mother, I can't do it. I wasn't born for that kind of life. I can't." I had no words, only placed a hand on his shoulder. Inside me echoed a question. Had Edward been too harsh, forcing him to face such brutal truth? Yet I remembered the calm in Edward's eyes before he left. He had believed that only by touching the raw edge of deprivation would Simon ever learn the weight of responsibility. Meanwhile, across the city, Michael still sat in the Veterans Hall. The men and women spoke in a circle, sharing stories no report could ever capture. One lost an arm, another lost an entire family, another lost their youth in jungles far from home. Michael held a pen, yet not a single word reached the page. Sweat beaded on his brow. Then an older veteran, hair streaked with gray, leaning on crutches, fixed him with weary eyes. His voice struck like a hammer. "What have you ever done to deserve this freedom you live in?" The room fell silent. My son sat frozen, and I knew this was the first moment he was truly forced to look into himself. The first days dragged on, heavy as stone pressing down on each of my children's shoulders. I could see them clinging to their pride, yet the cracks had begun to show. Michael was the first to collide head-on with reality. At another interview session, a veteran named Robert was introduced. He had lost both legs in the war and sat in an old wheelchair, his faded uniform frayed at the seams. His voice was low but steady. "I was once a mechanical engineer. All I need now is a desk job, any position where I can use my mind. I don't want pity. I just need a chance." The HR manager of a partner company glanced briefly at his file, then shook his head coldly. "We're sorry. That position has been filled." His eyes flickered down to Robert's missing legs, an unspoken rejection sharper than words. I saw Michael sit frozen, a flicker of confusion flashing in his gaze. This wasn't numbers on a report, nor investment strategies. This was a man of flesh and blood, denied not for lack of skill, but for the scars of war. Robert wheeled himself out, his face stiff, but his eyes betraying a humiliation that could not be hidden. Silence fell across the room, and Michael, once so sure he knew how to run things, could only grip his pen, his hand trembling ever so slightly. Elsewhere, Laura was invited to visit a gathering of war widows. The room was small, paint peeling from the walls, a few wooden chairs circling a round table. No fresh flowers, no chandeliers, only the warmth of worn but steadfast faces. A middle-aged woman, her hair streaked with gray, began to speak. Her husband had enlisted when their first child was only months old. 6 months later, he was gone, killed on foreign soil. They handed me a folded flag, and that was it. No one came back to ask how I survived, how I fed my child. I worked endlessly, 3 jobs at once, and still it was never enough. By the time my children grew up, all I had left were calloused hands and an empty room. Her voice caught, eyes glistening but dry. Then she looked around and smiled faintly. We don't want pity. We just want to be heard, to know we haven't been entirely forgotten. I watched Laura straighten in her chair. The polite smile on her lips slowly faded. She nodded, trying to look sympathetic, but her eyes betrayed bewilderment. I knew she had never heard stories like these. In Laura's world, pain was scandal on tabloids. Fleeting failures quickly replaced by the next glittering spotlight. But here, pain did not vanish, it stayed, rooted deep, breathing in every sigh. When another woman placed her calloused hand gently over Laura's and whispered, "You're fortunate you still have family by your side," I saw my daughter recoil ever so slightly. In that moment, she seemed estranged not only from those women, but from the very life she was living at the orphanage. Simon continued to stumble like a stranger in a foreign land. By day, he grudgingly helped with chores, scowling at the damp mold creeping along the walls, at the constant noise of children running about. By night, he lay stretched on a creaking iron bed, irritated by the frayed blanket that barely covered him. But what truly unsettled him wasn't the hardship, it was the clear, unblinking eyes always watching. The children there didn't know Simon as the wealthy Wilson heir. To them, he was just another grown-up and maybe, just maybe, someone to lean on. One afternoon, Simon sat on the front steps, lighting a cigarette only to stub it out quickly for fear Jonathan might catch him. A boy of about 7 shuffled over, messy-haired, dark-eyed, clutching a tattered teddy bear. "Mister," the boy asked softly but clearly, "do you go home to your mother?" Simon froze, the cigarette slipping from his fingers. I could almost picture his face then, stunned, as though someone had torn away his armor. For the boy, it was likely nothing more than a child's curiosity. But for Simon, the words cut deep. They dragged up memories he always tried to escape, nights of staggering home drunk. The sight of me waiting in the living room, the look in Edward's eyes when his youngest son drifted further from every duty. Simon swallowed hard, unable to answer. The boy blinked, hugging the worn bear tighter, and murmured, "I don't have a mother to go home to." Then he ran off, leaving Simon sitting rigid, his hands on his knees, his gaze lost in the distance. In that moment, I believed my son had, for the first time, felt the hollow ache of another soul, an emptiness no wealth could ever fill. That night, just as I had drifted into sleep, the phone rang. Simon's voice came through, trembling, halting in a way I had never heard from him. "Mother, I can't take it. I hate that place. I hate the misery. But Mom, I don't want to run away either." I gripped the receiver, my heart torn yet warmed. In the sound of his heavy breathing, I heard something else. He had begun to change, if only a faint glimmer of light in a long night. I often believed people only truly change when the fractures within can no longer be hidden. For Michael and Laura, those fractures began to show after days of trial. Michael returned from the veterans' interviews with a heaviness in his face. Gone was the confident posture of a corporate executive. Gone the cold authority of a man used to giving orders. I found him sitting in the study late at night, the lamp still burning, his gaze fixed on an old photograph resting on the shelf. It was a picture of the 3 children when they were young, standing beside Edward. Edward wore his suit, one hand on Michael's shoulder, but his eyes were turned toward his pocket watch as if his mind was never fully with his children. Michael stared for a long while, then spoke suddenly, voice rough with grief. "So, Father was never really there. I remember the plays at school he promised to attend, but never came. I remember the dinners, the empty chair Mother always set. He was always busy, and I thought if I succeeded, he'd finally see me. But in the end, I've only become a reflection of him." I stood silently in the doorway, each word piercing my heart like a needle. Michael, the strongest, the proudest, was finally seeing the hollow in his life. As for Laura, one evening I found her standing for a long time before her mirror. The yellow lamp glowed across her carefully painted face, but tears streaked black lines through the mascara. She whispered to her reflection, as though confessing, "I'm no different from him." Cold, selfish, obsessed with image and ego, she pressed her palm against the glass, staring into her reddened eyes. I saw her trembling, as if for the first time daring to admit that the very faults she condemned in her father ran through her blood as well. When she turned and saw me, she forced a smile, her voice hoarse. Mother, I tried to prove to the world I was worthy, but in the end, I'm nothing more than a poor copy of him. I stepped closer, my hand resting gently on her shoulder. In that moment, I realized the cracks in my daughter's heart were not signs of collapse, but opening slivers through which light might enter. Simon surprised me most of all. He had despised every duty at the orphanage. Yet one afternoon I saw him seated at the old piano in the common room. At first, he struck a few keys aimlessly, as if to pass the time. The sounds were clumsy, uneven, but the children rushed over instantly, gathering round, eyes shining. One little voice called out, "Play more, Uncle, please." Simon laughed, awkward but softened, and began a simple melody he remembered from childhood. I knew it at once, the tune Edward used to hum when the family was still whole. In the days before distance grew between us, the notes trembled at first, but grew warmer. The children clapped along, singing in broken voices. Simon blinked in surprise, almost disbelieving the scene around him. Slowly, his shoulders relaxed, and a shy smile spread across his face. For the first time in years, my youngest son did not laugh through the haze of liquor, nor wear the mask of indifference. He smiled, truly smiled, a light, unguarded smile born of realizing that someone needed him. That evening, when I came to fetch him, Simon said softly, "Mother, the kids liked when I played the piano. I never thought something so simple could make anyone happy." His voice trembled faintly, but I heard in it a fragile comfort he had never known. As my children sank deeper into their separate trials, I quietly returned to Edward's study. The scent of old wood and dried ink still lingered. I pulled open a drawer and found a leather-bound notebook, its edges worn smooth. It was his journal. I turned the pages slowly, lines written with care, filled with memories of war, reflections on his work, and so many mentions of family. Halfway through, one sentence stood out, written in darker strokes, as though pressed into the page. "True inheritance is learning how to love." I sat in silence for a long time, tears falling onto the paper, and at last, I understood everything Edward had left behind was not to punish our children, but to teach them the only path that could save this family. I will never forget the morning Michael came to me in the kitchen. He wore a plain shirt, none of his usual polished suits. On the table, he spread out a stack of documents, his voice calm yet carrying something unfamiliar, a resolve I had never seen in my eldest son. "Mother, I think I can start a small project, just a pilot group, but we'll hire a few veterans into one of the subsidiaries. Not high positions, but at least they'll have jobs, salaries, opportunities." I looked up and saw in his eyes no longer the cold steel I had grown used to. Instead, there was uncertainty, as though he feared his own words might sound foolish. I smiled softly. "Son, that is a beginning. Your father would be proud." Michael gave no reply, only a faint nod. But I knew this step, however small, was the first crack in the armor of pride that had encased him all his life. Meanwhile, Laura was undergoing her own transformation. She, who had always guarded her perfect image, agreed this time to appear on television not as a social media star, but as Edward Wilson's daughter. I sat in the living room, watching Laura on screen. She wore a simple blue dress, her makeup light, her eyes carrying a flicker of anxiety. The host asked, "Could you share why you're organizing this fundraiser?" Laura drew a deep breath and spoke, her voice trembling but sincere. "I grew up in a wealthy family, but that doesn't mean we were free from mistakes. My father fought in a war, and he carried wounds few ever understood. His will left us confused, even angry, but I believe he wanted us to learn how to care for others. And today, I want to begin by raising funds for war widows, women who have lost more than anyone else." She paused, her eyes glistening. It wasn't a flawless speech, but for the first time, my daughter wasn't hiding her heart behind glamour. She was letting the world see her truth. Applause filled the studio. The host smiled warmly, and Laura bowed her head, her lips trembling in gratitude. Watching from home, my chest tightened. I realized my daughter was stepping out of her father's shadow, and out of her own. If Michael was learning to set aside his ego and open the door for veterans. If Laura was finding her voice in compassion, then Simon. He surprised me the most, that the orphanage, where he once seethed with irritation, he was beginning to settle. One afternoon, I arrived and found him in the yard, a worn-out ball in his hand, shouting, "Come on, pass it here." The children shrieked, chasing the ball, their faces flushed with sunlight. Simon laughed loudly, sweat soaking through his shirt, looking every bit like a real coach. In the evening, Simon sat by the old piano, children clustered around him. Some tapped the table with their hands, some sang off-key, but the room buzzed with joy. Patiently, he guided them through each note, each chord. "That's it. One more time. Excellent." His voice rang out, no trace of the party-driven young man he once was. From a distance, my heart sank and softened. This was the Simon I remembered as a boy, the child who used to sit beside me in the living room, tinkering with the keys, giggling as melodies came alive. It seemed that among these children with no home, he had rediscovered the part of his heart that had been lost. One Sunday, Jonathan invited the family to the center for a community gathering. Michael arrived with several veterans he had just employed, faces both proud and hesitant. Laura entered hand in hand with the war widows, as if she had already become part of their story. Simon bustled about with the children, passing a ball here, tuning a guitar string there, when the three siblings stood side by side in the courtyard. Surrounded by laughter, hand chatter, a photographer raised his camera. I watched the moment unfold, Michael smiling genuinely, Laura leaning in naturally, Simon throwing an arm over his brother's shoulder. Click. The shutter captured it. The Wilson siblings, smiling together with the community for the first time in years, my vision blurred with tears. In that fleeting moment, I believed Edward was smiling too, from somewhere beyond. One crisp autumn morning, we gathered once more in Jonathan's office. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, pooling across the dark wooden desk where neatly stacked files lay waiting. I sensed this day would not be like the others, and I was right. Jonathan unclasped his leather case and withdrew a thick document. He looked at each of my children in turn, then spoke slowly. "It is time for you to hear about the final trial. Edward did not want each of you to change in isolation. He wanted you to build something lasting together. Specifically, a community center for veterans, widows, and orphans." The room fell into stunned silence. I heard Michael's quiet exhale, Simon's chair scraping in irritation, Laura's swallow tightening the air. Jonathan went on. "Edward outlined clear roles for each of you. Michael, you will manage finances, ensuring transparency and fairness. Laura, you will handle public relations, fundraising, and the center's image. Simon, you will oversee daily operations, making the center function like a home." Michael pressed a hand to his forehead, brows knit tight. He was accustomed to controlling money, but working alongside his siblings that would grate on him. Laura bit her lip, though in her eyes I caught a flicker of light. Perhaps she saw this as a chance to create something greater than the shallow events she once curated. Simon let out a short, mocking laugh. "Of course. Father knew how to torment us even from the grave. I'm supposed to live with these two every day in some cramped community center." Jonathan's gaze was steady as he faced my youngest. "Not torment, Simon. A test. If you cannot learn to trust and complement one another, then your father's legacy will remain only a dream." Beside them, my heart wrestled with itself. Part of me feared what I knew of their tempers, 3 pieces cut from such different cloth. Yet another part burned with hope, because if they succeeded, if they could find a way to hold hands, Then that would be the miracle Edward had left behind. I looked at them, Michael with calculating eyes, Laura's face still streaked with tears, Simon smirking with false defiance, and in silence, I prayed, Lord, give them one chance to find each other again. The first weeks were nothing short of war. Michael buried himself in spreadsheets, scowling over every invoice, every projected expense. He demanded signatures for each outlay. Even the purchase of paint cans drew his complaints. Laura, exasperated, slammed the phone down after another round of calls for sponsorship. You'll never understand, Michael, she snapped. People don't give money because of your cold numbers. They need a story. They need to believe. Simon, never one to endure constraint, flared when he saw his brother tightening control over the budget. I can't take care of dozens of kids with crumbs. If you keep holding everything back, this center will collapse before it's even built. I watched the three of them, convinced at times they would tear their father's will apart with their own hands. Their voices ricocheted through the small meeting room, accusations, jabs, every word sharp as a blade. Yet, as the days slipped by, I began to notice something shifting. One afternoon, when the builders reported a shortage of materials, Michael insisted on rejecting the purchase because it exceeded the budget. Simon slammed the ledger shut and stormed out. But later that day, Michael quietly paid from his own pocket. He said nothing, leaving only a note. Just get it done. When Simon learned of it, his usual sarcasm faded into silence. Laura, too, began to change. She realized that the spotlight of television was no longer a stage for vanity, but a bridge to connection. At a fundraiser, she spoke candidly about her father, about the invisible wounds he carried from war. Tears streamed down the faces of many in the audience, and the donations exceeded all expectations. For the first time, Michael praised her. You did well. The words startled Laura. She froze, then allowed a small, genuine smile to bloom. And Simon, I saw him spend countless evenings with the children in the makeshift shelter. When one fell ill, he stayed up all night by the bedside. When volunteer groups arrived, he took the lead in organizing tasks. Michael saw it, Laura saw it, and I saw it too. My youngest child, once adrift in parties and indulgence, was learning how to be a pillar. The tiny cracks began to close. In the heat of arguments, they learned to listen. In the shadow of doubt, they learned to trust. And in the sweat of their labor, they began to rediscover each other as siblings. The inauguration day drew near. The center was taking shape. Bright painted walls, a playground echoing with bouncing balls, a community room humming with music. As I walked through the space, my heart trembled, both eased and unsettled, as though I were touching Edward's dream made flesh. On the eve of the opening, Jonathan summoned us. He laid a sealed envelope on the table, reverent as though it carried a soul. There is one final letter, Jonathan said. Edward wanted you to read it on the night before the center opens. I looked at my children. They were silent, no longer ready to erupt in rage as before, but in their eyes lingered anticipation, a quiet yearning. As my fingers brushed the envelope, I felt as though I were laying my hand on Edward's heart, its last beat still echoing across time. Jonathan carefully opened the envelope and withdrew a single sheet of folded paper. He did not read it himself but handed it to Michael. This is the final letter. Your father wanted you to see his words with your own eyes, not through anyone else's voice. Michael hesitated, his large hands trembling as he held the paper. Slowly, he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the familiar, deliberate handwriting. I saw his shoulders quiver, and then his husky voice broke the silence of the room. I leave you not money, but the chance to become better human beings. The first sentence fell like a tolling bell. I heard Laura gasp, covering her mouth with her hand. Simon dropped his gaze to the floor, his eyes flaring before he quickly looked away. Michael read on, voice faltering, pausing to swallow down the weight of emotion. Wealth will fade. Houses will change owners. I saw comrades fall in an instant, unable to carry even a single possession with them. The only thing that endures is character, and I want you to understand that if a man is hollow, holding the whole world in his hands means nothing." Laura turned her face aside, but I still caught the tears streaking her cheeks, smudging the makeup she guarded so carefully. Michael passed the letter to her. Laura drew a shaky breath and continued, her voice unsteady but clear. "I know you are angry with me. I know you believe I betrayed you, but trust me, I did this not to punish, but to give you one last chance. A chance to grow. Not everyone is given the chance to make amends, but I want you to have it." Her tears fell onto the page, blurring the ink. She quickly wiped them away, her hand trembling. Finally, Simon took the letter. He lingered in silence, staring at it for a long time before speaking. His voice was lower than usual, stripped of defiance, as if, in this moment, he was no longer the reckless boy but a son bearing his heart. "I am no longer here to guide you. You will stumble, you will quarrel, you will hurt each other. But if you can turn back, if you can reach out your hands, this family will not be lost. My hope is that when you read this letter, you no longer see me as a stranger but as a part of yourselves." The room was utterly still. No more shouting, no more blame. Only the sound of uneven breaths and muffled sobs restrained too long. I sat there, watching my 3 children, and for the first time saw genuine tears fall, not from anger, not from grief, but from the dawning realization that Edward had never truly left them. He was still leading them, only in another way. As they folded the letter back with trembling hands, my own memories surged those nights when Edward sat alone in his study, the yellow desk lamp casting its weary glow across the lined face of a man who had carried too much. I often stood quietly at the doorway, watching him write. Sometimes he would set the pen down, sit motionless for long minutes, his eyes distant as though facing the shadows of old battlefields. At times, I saw his lips press tight, and tears fall silently onto the page. Once, I entered and laid my hand on his shoulder. "Edward, what do you write so much for?" He looked up, smiling warily yet gently. "I write for the future, Eleanor. When I am gone, they will still need to hear my voice. If I don't speak now, one day it may be too late." I never forgot that gaze, the eyes of a man who knew he was leaving soon, yet still fought for one last chance to love now. With the final letter read, I understood everything. He had not written with ink alone, but with his entire life. Jonathan, still calm and steady, read the last line aloud, his voice clear and resonant, as though Edward himself were standing among us. "If you change, the rest will be yours." The words echoed, filling the room that had once grown accustomed to quarrels. I saw Michael lift his head, eyes red but resolute. Laura clutched the letter tightly, as though gripping a newfound chance. Simon gave a small nod, his boyish face suddenly etched with rare gravity. I placed my hand over the journal I still carried. In my mind, the page I had read days earlier appeared once more. True inheritance is learning how to love. Now it fused with the final words of Edward's letter, becoming the testament none of us could deny. I looked at my 3 children, and for the first time in years, I saw them sitting close, not to fight, but to listen. Silently, I whispered, "Edward, you did it. You made them open their eyes to themselves." And I knew, tomorrow, when the community center opened its doors, they would walk forward with new hearts. The day of the inauguration dawned with gentle sunshine, a cool autumn breeze drifting softly through the air. I stood before the new building, gazing at its bright walls, the polished plaque that read Wilson Community Center. My heart trembled not only because the project was complete, but because I knew this was Edward's final wish. Now standing firm in the daylight, people poured in by the dozens, veterans leaning on crutches, widows with silver hair, children holding hands as they skipped into the courtyard. Their voices and laughter mingled together, weaving a rhythm that felt both ordinary and sacred. As the children's orchestra struck up a welcoming tune, Jonathan stepped onto the stage. "This center is the result of a remarkable journey," he announced. But today, we are not just cutting a ribbon for a building, we are witnessing the transformation of an entire family. He motioned for Michael to come forward. My eldest adjusted the microphone, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. The coldness once etched into his gaze was gone. In its place, I saw a rare honesty. I used to believe success was measured only by money and power. Michael said, his voice rough yet steady, "When I learned my father left his fortune elsewhere, I was furious. I wanted to sue. But then I met veterans, men who lost more than I could ever imagine. And I realized I had never understood how precious freedom really was. Today, I want to apologize. For my greed. For my selfishness." The applause that followed was not thunderous, but warm, carrying the weight of forgiveness. Next came Laura. She wore a simple dress, her eyes glistening as she stepped forward. She held the microphone with both hands and drew in a deep breath. I lived in the spotlight, chasing shallow praise. I thought if I kept up a flawless image, I would be loved. But when I met women who lost their husbands to war, I learned that true pain cannot be hidden behind makeup. I was selfish. I was cold. And I regret it. Today, I want to use my voice not for myself, but for those who deserve to be heard. A soft sob rose from the back rows, where several widows clasped hands and nodded through their tears. Finally, Simon stepped forward. He no longer carried his usual swagger. His shirt was wrinkled from holding a child, his hair tousled after running with the little ones outside. But in his eyes, I saw a light I had not seen for many years. I used to think everything was a joke. I thought responsibility was a chain. But then, a child asked me, "Do you go home to your mother?" That question broke me, because I realized, for years, I had abandoned my own home. So today, I want to say sorry to my mother, to my brother and sister, and to the children I once tried to avoid. Today, I stand here, as a brother, as a son, not as someone running away. The courtyard erupted in applause, loud and heartfelt. I clasped my hands tightly, tears streaming down my cheeks, but they were tears of faith. The clapping rolled on, swelling outward from the front rows to the gates of the center. I looked around and saw faces brimming with emotion, veterans nodding solemnly, widows wiping their eyes, children beaming wide smiles with missing teeth. And in that moment, I realized we were no longer a family under scrutiny, whispered about in gossip. We had become part of a community, exactly what Edward had always longed for. I clenched my hands together to hold back the tears, but it was useless. They spilled hot down my cheeks. In my heart I whispered, "Edward, do you see? Our children are beginning to find themselves. Your wish is alive, beating within these walls every day." Jonathan stepped forward to the stage. His voice carried deep, steady, resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen, there is one more matter to announce. Beyond what has already been revealed, Mr. Edward Wilson left another portion of his estate, but it was not to be handed directly to the family." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw Michael lean forward slightly, Laura's eyes widen, and Simon frowned faintly. Jonathan raised the file high, his gaze sweeping over the three siblings as though to carve each word into them. Edward wrote, "If my children have learned the lesson of love, if they have truly changed, then the remainder shall be theirs. But, under one condition, this center must be sustained for at least 3 years, operating transparently, serving its purpose faithfully. Should they fail, the entire sum will be transferred permanently to the community fund." The audience erupted into hushed whispers like rising waves. I turned and saw my children fall silent. Michael pressed his lips tight, his mind calculating not for self-interest this time, but under the weight of responsibility. Laura placed a hand over her chest, eyes bright yet unwavering. Simon gave the faintest nod, an unspoken acceptance. I drew in a long breath. Edward's words, carried through Jonathan's voice, rang like a final bell closing one journey, yet opening another as applause rose once more, swelling through the courtyard. I knew this was not only the inauguration of a building, it was the beginning of a new family, a new legacy. And I whispered within, "Edward, you have won, not with wealth, but with the power of love." After the day of the inauguration, the atmosphere in my family seemed to shift. No more tense meetings, no more suspicious stares or heavy reproaches. Instead, I began to see my children change little by little like dry trees soaking up rain, slowly sprouting new buds. Michael, who once only cared about contracts and numbers, now set aside a few days each week to return to the center. He still sat in his elegant office downtown, still wore tailored suits, but his schedule now included meetings with veterans. I remember one evening when he came home late, stepped into the kitchen where I was cooking dinner, and whispered, "Mom, today I interviewed a soldier who lost his arm. He said he never thought there'd be a place for him." I realized, just by opening a small door, I could change an entire life. I looked at my eldest son and saw his eyes soften, no longer the cold sharpness of before. He was learning balance between the market and the heart. Laura was different in her own way. Her luxurious apartment was still there, but the party lights no longer blazed every weekend. She spent more time attending fundraisers, visiting widows she once thought of as strangers. One evening, I found her sitting in the living room dressed simply, hair tied neatly, flipping through a list of people in need. She looked up and smiled. "Mom, I've never felt this real. No need to embellish, no need to prove anything. Just listening and helping someone, it's enough." That smile reminded me of the little girl who used to curl up in my arms and ask, "Mom, do I look like a princess?" Now, she no longer sought borrowed light, she was glowing from her own soul. And Simon, the change in him was perhaps the most striking. From resentment and avoidance, he now practically lived in the orphanage. The children called him Uncle Simon with shining eyes, clinging to his hands. I once saw him in the yard, teaching them to play soccer, his laughter echoing all around. Another day, he patiently taught a little boy to strum the guitar. Though the child's tiny fingers couldn't press the strings properly, Simon leaned down gently. "It's okay, just try again. Music is like life, you make mistakes, then you practice, but never quit." Hearing those words, I felt my throat tighten. My once reckless youngest son had grown by becoming a pillar for children who had no one else. Looking at all three, I saw it clearly. They no longer lived only for themselves. They had learned to open their hearts, to give, and in doing so, they had found one another again. There were afternoons when I sat on the stone bench in the garden of the center, listening to the children's laughter, the sound of the piano drifting from the common room, mingling with the conversations of widows and veterans. In those sounds, I felt my family slowly blending into a new rhythm of life. Michael no longer rushed off after meetings. He stayed behind, listening carefully to the stories of old soldiers, jotting notes as if every detail mattered. Laura no longer cared about magazine covers. Instead, she eagerly discussed the next fundraising plan, her eyes sparkling with purpose. Simon no longer hid from responsibility. He strolled calmly around the yard with the children, hair tousled, his smile unexpectedly gentle. I looked at them and realized my family was no longer one of coldness, rivalry, and distance. They had found another kind of meaning, not in vast wealth, but in the lives they touched, in the hearts that began to heal. One late weekend afternoon, the community gathered to celebrate 1 month since the center had opened. People brought flowers, cakes, and words of gratitude. Jonathan suggested our family take a commemorative photo in front of the building. At first, Michael stood awkwardly to one side. Laura fussed with her hair. Simon pretended to joke to hide his unease. But then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, they drew closer. Michael slipped an arm around his sister's shoulder. Laura placed her hand on Simon's arm, and Simon tilted in, resting his hand on his brother's back. I stood in the middle, my heart trembling, eyes misty. When the camera clicked, the moment was captured. the Wilson family, after so many storms, smiling together before the scent of the place that carried Edward's greatest legacy. And I knew, if Edward could see that photograph, he would smile with peace, for this was what he had always wanted, not to leave behind fortune, but a family who had learned to love, and a community lifted together. I have a habit of standing by the second-floor window every afternoon. From there, I can see the entire garden of the center. Once, this place was just an overgrown patch of land. Now, clusters of flowers bloom in color, a ball rolls across the yard, music drifts from the common room, and above all the clear laughter of children fills the air. This afternoon was no different. Pale sunlight streamed down through the branches, painting shimmering streaks of light. Below, Simon was leading a group of kids in a soccer game. They cheered, calling his name as if he were truly their older brother. Nearby, Laura was speaking with a few widows, her hand clutching her notebook, and Michael stood with several veterans, discussing the new jobs he had just arranged for them. I stood silently, feeling as though I could hear Edward's heartbeat echoing back from this land. Turning toward the listener, or perhaps toward my own reflection in the glass, I whispered, "Money will fade, but compassion endures across generations. Over the years, I have seen wealth come and go. It once divided my family, once made our children resent their father. But only when they could no longer rely on money did they begin to find one another again." And now, among the laughter outside, I understood. Edward had left them a legacy no time could erase. I placed my hand on the window frame, my heart swelling with a feeling both tender and fierce, the conviction that everything we endured had not been in vain. As the evening light descended and the children's shadows stretched across the yard, an unexpected peace washed over me. Since the day Edward passed, I had often asked myself, was he too harsh, forcing our children to walk such a difficult path? But today, looking back, I finally knew the answer. Edward did not leave behind gold, nor did he leave a vast real estate empire as people believed. He left another kind of legacy, an invisible one, yet stronger than stone: character. Michael learned that success is not just measured in revenue, but in opening doors for those who once sacrificed. Laura realized that true beauty does not come from the spotlight, but from compassion, the courage to listen to another's pain. And Simon, the stubborn youngest son, finally found maturity in becoming a source of strength for fragile young souls. And I, as a mother, as a wife, learned that love does not end when someone departs. It can transform into a quiet current, flowing through wills, letters, and lessons, nurturing an entire generation. I slowly closed my eyes, listening to the laughter echoing from the center's courtyard. That laughter was like music, sometimes off-key, sometimes uneven, but always sincere. I knew Edward would be smiling. He had not only built an enterprise, but planted in his children the seeds of compassion. For me, this story is not an ending. It is a reminder that wealth may vanish, but character can be passed from one generation to the next like a torch, burning bright, handed on without end. I turn now, looking directly at you, the ones who have been listening to my story, and I leave you with the very question I once had to face. If it were you, would you choose wealth or transformation? My dear friends, if this story has touched your heart, I invite you to leave a comment and share your thoughts or your own experiences. And don't forget to subscribe, so we can continue to listen, to tell, and to live through stories together, stories that may be yours, or perhaps someone you once knew.